Students and guests, I'm Mr. Gorman, sometimes known as the Grammar Geek, but today I'm going to be the Shakespeare nerd. So I'm here with my dependable teaching assistant, Evie.
Say hello, Evie.
I want to talk about something that's been worrying me a little bit. And I know, compared to everything else, you've got much bigger fish to fry. This is a teacher worry. I've been thinking about the fact that you guys are going to be going through our school system, and all the students who are in 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade had this wonderful experience, and you're going to miss it. And the students coming up, 8th grade, 7th grade, 6th grade, they're going to have this experience. In fact, students all across the country and really around the world are going to have this experience, because in 9th grade, just about everywhere, we tend to teach Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. You're thinking, big deal. That, of all things, is the thing he's worried about. But it actually is a bummer, because shared experience matters. You know this, you're with your group of friends, if you've got a common joke, a movie that you've all seen, a TV show you can reference, it brings you together. And if you don't have that, you really are missing out on something. Well, Shakespeare is performed not just in the United States, not just where it was written in England. It's performed all over the world and has been for 400 years. And so educated people worldwide have this shared experience. And I don't want you to miss that, especially since as you go through school, you're going to be assigned to classes where less and less often will they be designed by grade level. More and more, you're going to be with students of different ages. And I don't want you to be sitting in a class with students who, during the COVID epidemic, were in 10th grade or 11th grade or 12th grade, or 8th grade or 7th grade or 6th grade, and they all have this experience and you missed out on it. That is part of the reason why we have to take some time to really look at Shakespeare, and specifically Romeo and Juliet. The other part is just the quality. There's a reason people have been performing this play for almost 400 years, basically nonstop. In fact, right now in the middle of this epidemic, people are still watching Shakespeare. They might not be able to do it in a live theater, but they're watching it at home. 400 years. That's a long time for these stories to last, and they've lasted because they're so good. I don't want you to miss that. Also, 9th grade tends to be the time when a lot of our great actors, directors, technical theater professionals, entertainment industry professionals discover their love of Shakespeare and their love of theater, their love of acting, their love of telling stories in this way. And maybe one of you will have that experience if we engage with Romeo and Juliet, and I don't want you to miss that. Here's my plan. And first of all, I want to make this very clear. This is all going to be supplementary. It would not be fair to say, hey, you've got to read Romeo and Juliet all by yourself and your grade hinges on it in the middle of a global pandemic, right? It's okay if you say, I've got too much on my plate right now. I'm taking care of my siblings, or I'm working, or whatever. I get it. But if you have time, this is something I don't want you to miss out on. Today, I'm going to share the prologue and just the very first part, just the first scene. I'm not an actor by training or profession, as you will soon see. I want to show you a little bit of the way the language works. Then, after watching this video, if you have a streaming service of any kind, I want you to watch a version of the play. Shakespeare was not designed to be read. He didn't write the plays so people would sit around a classroom and read them, even read them out loud. That's not the intent. You are supposed to see the play. In fact, in Shakespeare's day, they wouldn't say, I'm going to go see a play. They would say, I'm going to go hear a play. The language tells the story. Everything else, the costumes, that kind of stuff, that's just add-on. But it's hearing the language. That's what tells you the story. So I encourage you, watch a movie version rather than reading it first. I like to examine in my classes, I compare and contrast Franco Zeffirelli's movie version from 1968, so that's one you can check out, and then Baz Luhrmann's from 1996. Zeffirelli's was filmed in Italy, which is where the play is set, and the characters wear the kinds of costumes people would have worn in Shakespeare's time. So often my students think that one is more correct. But Baz Luhrmann's version actually uses more of the language of the play more consistently. And it's set in the modern day. Was the modern day in 1996. And I have to remind students, Shakespeare set his play in his modern day too. So that's not wrong. It's an option. One of a million choices that directors and actors get to make when they're choosing how to perform Shakespeare, all of which are correct if they fit with the author's vision and the audience's taste. That's one of the reasons directors and actors love Shakespeare so much. He gives them a lot of room to be creative. He just provides them all with this beautiful language and these rich, universal stories they can choose to use to show off their artistic ideas. After you've seen one or two versions, then we're going to have a contest. Now, I know not everyone has the technological means to do this, and I know some of you won't want to put yourself out there like this, and that's fine. This is optional. But if you're willing, what I'd like you to do is film yourself reading the prologue. Just the prologue, just 14 lines, and you can read it. No memorization necessary. Then attach your video to this optional assignment in the Google Classroom. I'm also going to make this video public on YouTube, so if you aren't one of my students, you can still participate by making your reading of the prologue and then posting it in the comments below. Make sure that's cool with your parents, please. Those of you in my class, I'll then make your videos accessible, but only to people in your class. So if you want to be visible to the whole world, post yours as a comment also. Again, make sure that's okay with your parents. So here's how the contest works. Out of my 2 Honors English 1 classes, the one that has more videos posted to the Google Classroom page in the next 2 weeks will win. Then, I'll randomly draw the name of one person from that class who turned in a video. I'll get in touch via email, and I'll order pizza for your family. Don't worry, even if 5th period wins, my son knows that he's not eligible to win the pizza party. Sorry, Noah. It would look a little sketch if the family winning the pizza party was my family. Let me introduce you to the prologue, the introduction to the play. In Shakespeare's time, there was often something before the prologue itself called the dumb show. That's not because it was dumb as in stupid. That's because it had no words. The actors would come out in costumes, and there might be some dance or music, and maybe they would just hint at who their characters were by the way they would make faces at each other. It was a smart way to get the unruly audience to calm down and get quiet before the show, kind of like trailers in a theater. Then, one guy would come out, yes, always a guy, super sexist in Shakespeare's day, and he would deliver the prologue. He's called the chorus because way before Shakespeare's time in ancient Greece, there would have been a whole choir that would have come out and sung this part, representing the voice of the community. But over time, that choir shrank, especially when theaters had to become traveling theater groups because of things like plagues. It was much easier to have one person on the road with your theater troupe than a whole choir, right? And this one guy would step out into the middle of the stage and tell the whole story of the play people were about to see. It's one giant super spoiler. Now, every year I teach this, students are like, why? No spoilers. And then I say, okay, show of hands. Who in this room has ever seen any single movie more than one time? Keep those hands up. Look around. And it's basically everybody. And then I ask, why? Why did you watch the same movie twice? You knew what would happen. And invariably, someone says, because it's a really good movie. Exactly. Shakespeare wasn't worried about spoilers because he knew the play was so good he didn't have to be worried. And that brings us to a cool concept I've talked about in class a couple of times. The suspension of disbelief. When we're taking in a story, if it's a good one and well told, either as a movie or a novel or a play or an opera or whatever, there's this cool thing that happens in our brains. That little voice that says, this isn't real. We turn it off, temporarily. If you were watching a movie and you couldn't do this, you wouldn't be able to enjoy it. You'd sit there in the theater the whole time and say, hey, guys, it's just a two-dimensional image projected on a screen. Same as every other movie. Who cares? Why are you guys watching this? But you don't do that. During the movie, you forget it's a movie. Now, it's also important that this is temporary. If you couldn't turn that little voice back on, you'd be a crazy person. At the end of the movie, you need to be able to say, it was a movie. There aren't really aliens attacking New York and fighting with superheroes. Otherwise, you might run screaming out of the theater. And during the story, you always have the ability to turn it back on. When you're reading a book, if it gets too scary or too sad, you can stop screaming or crying, close the book, and say, it isn't real, anytime you want. But if the story's well told, you won't want to do that until the end. Even if you already know how it ends, you have suspended your disbelief. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. We know that from the very beginning. And if we know what tragedy means, and we know what tragedies were like in Shakespeare's time and going all the way back to ancient Greece, we know that means the main characters die in the end. Spoiler. But Shakespeare can tell us that from the jump because he knows what I have experienced every single time I've seen this play done well. Even when I watch film versions I've seen before. When it's done well, you'll get near the end and you'll be on the edge of your seat thinking, but maybe not this time. Maybe this time, this movie, which I have seen before, will end differently. Maybe they'll live. Guess what? They won't. If they did, it would actually suck. They get married after knowing each other for a day. If they lived, it would just be the beginning of a story about an unhealthy marriage between two people who should have taken more time to get to know each other, rather than the exciting story of two people fighting back against everything in their world, saying they can't be together, and they're doing it because they love each other. And we want it to work out for them so badly. That's the engine of the play. Not the words, not the actors, not the costumes or the set. You, the audience. Your desire to live in a world where love wins is what powers the play. But love doesn't always win. And Shakespeare knew that. And you know it. And that's why we suspend our disbelief and let our hope and disappointment pull us through the plot of the play, despite the prologue. So, here's the text of the prologue. I'll read it because Shakespeare's language sounds beautiful even before you understand it, and then I'll walk you through it. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows do, with their death, bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage. The which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. If we were in school, I would actually spend a whole day teaching you about the structure of a sonnet, of an Elizabethan sonnet. This is a very specific form, and we would practice that, learn all about those. We don't have time, because, the world is crazy. So instead, let's look at what this means. Let's go through it. Two households, both alike in dignity. That means in rank. So we've got two families, and they've got the same rank in their society. In where? In Verona. Fair just means pretty. So in the pretty city of Verona, that's where we lay our scene. That's where our play is set. Come right out saying, hey, this is where the play is set. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny. They've had this fight going on for a long time. They probably don't even know why their families hate each other. They've just hated each other for, generations. Who knows why? That's just who we are. We're the Montagues. We hate the Capulets. We're the Capulets. We hate the Montagues. I don't know why. They've got this thing that's been going on, but lately it has broken out into new mutiny. Something's changed, and now there's violence. And it makes civil blood is making civil hands unclean. This is a pun on the word civil. So it's saying, on the one hand, these are the upper class people, but they are making civil in the sense of polite people have blood on their hands. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, so from out of the family lines of these two families, loins, not lions, make sure you read that part carefully, like loincloth. So, from out of the deadly, fatal means deadly, loins, of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Star-crossed means, like, when they were born, their astrological charts, they were fated. These lovers take their, and then notice this carefully, life. Not lives, life. As though they've always had one life together. Whose misadventured, piteous overthrows. This line looks so hard, but it's not once we know what the words mean. So, we're talking about these two people who share one life, and they are misadventured. Things are gonna go wrong for them. Piteous. We're gonna feel pity for them. Overthrows. The way that they lose. So their unfortunate, pathetic failure does, with their death, bury their parents' strife. The fact that they're going to die is actually going to end the violence. Period. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, so the scary story of their deadly love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, the fact that their parents' fighting is still going on during that, which, but their children's end, naught could remove. So, unless their children die, nothing else was going to stop their parents' rage, is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage. Traffic's an interesting word here. We have this modern idea of traffic. We think of cars crisscrossing. But some of you know that there's an older definition of traffic. How many of you know the word narcotraficante? Well, drug trafficker doesn't mean drug cars going in different directions. It means sales. You don't have to traffic in drugs. You could traffic in whatever, right? What do these people specifically traffic in? Who are... So what the prologue is telling you is, the people on this stage, they traffic in stories. And this story is what they're going to sell you. This is the traffic. This is their merchandise. And then he says, the which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. So he's telling the audience, if you listen patiently, what you've missed while I've talked to you in just 14 lines and told you the whole story, don't worry. Our toil, our hard work, will struggle to fix. We're going to tell you this story. We're going to work really hard, and don't worry, by the end, you're going to get it. It's a good way to start the play. The audience now knows. Don't worry. If you miss something, you're going to get it. And that brings us to the beginning of the play. So the next thing that happens, a couple of guys come out on stage. They're actually not important to the story particularly. These are the servants of the nobles. And the whole story, we've already been told, is about these noble families, right? So these are the servants who work in the household of these nobles. And their names are Samson and Gregory, and they're basically here for comic relief. But notice that the idea of comedy has changed. There are going to be things they say that we would not think are funny anymore. They are inappropriate. So, Samson and Gregory come out on stage, and they are armed. They're carrying swords, which is kind of unusual, or have to be told. Certain servants normally were not allowed to just wander around with swords, but the city has become violent enough because of these two families' conflict that the servants are even armed. And they come out, and Samson says, Gregory, on my word, will not carry coals. Weird first line, unless we understand what that means. He's starting a pun here on the idea of coals. And this goes back to an idea in the Bible, that if you love your enemies, you heap burning coals on their heads. So, carrying coals came to be an expression for holding a grudge. So, he's saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to, just love my enemy and then, have my enemy love me and carry coals around. I'm going to fight. But Gregory is an idiot. Or maybe not. Maybe pretending to be an idiot is how he deals with Samson, who may also be an idiot. So Gregory says, no, because then we'd be colliers. Colliers are people whose job was to be coal carriers. And Samson now makes a pun on the word collier. He says, I mean, and we be in choler, notice the spelling. Choler means anger, and we be in choler will draw. What do you think he means by draw? Does not mean get out a pen and paper. And Gregory says, aye, well you live, draw your neck out of the collar. Saying, don't draw your sword, draw your neck out of the noose. Because if you go around starting fights, you're going to get hung. And Samson says, I strike quickly being moved. If somebody gives me reason, I get mad fast. And Gregory says, but thou art not quickly moved to strike. People don't actually make you fight. Gregory probably knows Samson is all talk, right? He doesn't actually fight with anybody. And Samson says, a dog of the house of Montague moves me. If I see one of those guys, that would get me to fight. And Gregory says, to move is to stir, and to be valiant is to stand. Therefore, if thou art moved, thou runnest away. So he's saying, oh, really? If you're moved to get into a fight, maybe you could just move, get out of there. And Samson says, a dog of that house shall move me to stand. I will take the wall of any man or maid of Montague's. If I see one of those Montague dogs, that will move me, make me stand my ground. I will take the wall of any man or maid of Montague's. Now, in order to understand this, we have to understand something about plumbing. So, in Shakespeare's day, they did not have modern plumbing. They didn't have toilets in their homes, right? So what did you do? Well, if you lived in a little house, there was like a little row house like mine. I live in one of these little skinny houses, and you had your shop underneath. You lived up on the second story or third story. There generally weren't fourth stories. Then what you do is you do your business in a little pot in your room and then throw it out the window. Yeah. So imagine what the streets were like. So down on the street level, there'd be like an awning. We still see this as a tradition, people putting awnings out, but not for the same reason, I hope. So you'd have this awning, and if both shops on both sides have the awnings, where do you want to walk? Yeah, you want to walk as close to the wall as you can, right? Because if you have to step out in the middle of the street, yeah. So, when you were walking down the street, people would see each other and they would let the person of higher rank take the wall. In other words, you'd say, oh, I see you coming. I will step out into the middle of the street. Gross, right? And to not do that was to say to that person, I see you, and I don't think you're of a higher rank. You have to go out there in the middle of the street. Now, of course, most of the time people would be polite about this. They weren't constantly getting into fights about it, but this was a way of insulting somebody. You could refuse to let them take the wall and force them out into the poop, right? So, Samson says, if I see one of those Montagues, and the way he's saying it is like, even if he sees one of the nobles of the Montague family, he's going to take the wall. He's going to push that person out into the street, which of course would be a huge insult. But he doesn't just say any man. he says, or maid. In other words, even if he sees one of the women, even one of the young women from that family, he's going to force them out into the poop. And Gregory says, that shows thee a weak slave, for the weakest goes to the wall. That makes you look weak, because everybody knows we're supposed to let weaker people near the wall. Super sexist, right? But still. Samson says, true, and therefore, women, being the weaker vessels, are ever thrust to the wall. Therefore, I will push one to use men from the wall, and thrust his maids to the wall. Gross. If you don't know what he's talking about a man pushing a woman up against a wall against her will, he's making a rape joke. This would not be acceptable as the modern idea of comedy, right? But the audience probably in Shakespeare's day would have laughed. Society was sexist enough that they just kind of went, yep, rape happens all the time, and it's somewhat socially acceptable. So Samson is threatening to rape any woman from the Montague family that he sees. And Gregory is not cool with that. Gregory says, the quarrel is between our masters and us, their men. Samson says, 'tis all one. I will show myself a tyrant. When I have fought with the men, I will be cruel with the maids, and cut off their heads. He's threatening to say, whenever I see one of the guys from the Montagues, I'm going to get in a fight with him and kill him. And when I see one of the women, I'm going to be mean to her and cut her head off. And Gregory's like, what? The heads of the maids? And it turns out Samson is making a dirty joke. He says, the heads of the maids, or their maiden heads, take it in what sense thou wilt. I'm either going to cut their heads off or break their maiden heads. In other words, take their virginity. Then he says, take that however you want. And Gregory says, they must take it in the sense they feel it. In other words, well, they'll have to take that however they feel it. And Samson says, me they shall feel while I am able to stand, and 'tis known I'm a pretty piece of flesh. He says, oh, they'll feel me while I can stand up. Little double meaning there. And Gregory makes a pretty good joke here about this idea of saying he's a pretty piece of flesh. See, he's saying, I'm really handsome. Everybody knows that I'm quite the guy. And the phrase they would have used back then is flesh. But they also used flesh to talk about meat that was either beef or poultry, but they didn't consider fish to be meat. I know, weird, right? Yeah, weird. Secret. Fish is also meat. But back then they didn't think so. They had separate words for that. So he says, I'm a pretty piece of flesh. He's saying, like, everybody likes this guy. I'm handsome. But Gregory plays on the word flesh and says, 'tis well thou art not fish. If thou hadst been poor John. This joke does not translate now because we don't know what those things mean. But he says, it's a good thing you are not fish, that you're meat, because if you had been fish, you'd be a sardine. Then, when he's just made a joke about Samson's meat, he then says, draw thy tool. Here comes two of the house of Montagues. So, the audience would crack up because even though he's talking about draw your sword, he literally is talking about his sardine and then says, hey, whip it out! Here comes two of the house of Montagues. And Samson pulls his sword out, but says, my naked weapon is out. Quarrel, I will back thee. So let's start a fight. I'll get your back. And Gregory says, how? Turn thy back and run? I know how you're going to get my back. You're just going to run away. And Samson says, fear me not. And Gregory says, no, marry, I fear thee. Marry means like, seriously, truly. I am afraid that you're going to run away. Samson says, let us take the law of our sides. Let them begin. So he's gone from walking around going, if I see any of those Montagues, I'm going to start a fight, to now, as soon as he actually sees some Montagues, saying, let's let them start the fight. I actually don't want to be the one to start the fight. And Gregory says, I will frown as I pass by and let them take it as they list. So I'll tell you what, I'll frown at them. They've gone from threatening to fight with him to giving him the stink eye. Samson says, nay, as they dare, I will bite my thumb at them, which is a disgrace to them if they bear it. Now, this is an expression we don't use in the United States. They still do use it in Italy. Biting your thumb at somebody is just a different cultural variation on flipping them off. So he's saying, it's like that. So he's saying, when we see them, I'm going to flip them off. And if they just take it, that's a disgrace to them. And that's when Abraham and Balthazar come on stage. And Samson flips off Abraham. And Abraham says, do you bite your thumb at us, sir? And Samson says, I do bite my thumb, sir.
And then Abraham says, do you bite your thumb at us, sir?
Are you biting your thumb at us? And Samson says, but he can't say he's biting his thumb at them. He says, I do bite my thumb. I flip off. Can't say I'm flipping you off, because then he'd be starting the fight. And Abraham repeats it. Yeah, but do you flip us off? Do you bite your thumb at us, sir? And Samson turns to Gregory, and he's realizing, like, uh-oh, I may have just crossed a line. Would the law be on our side if I say I? Is the law of our side if I say I? Would that be okay? And Gregory's like, no. And so Samson's like, turns back to Abraham and says, no, sir, I do not bite my thumb at you, sir. But I do bite my thumb, sir. He's saying, like, I'm not flipping you off, but I am flipping off. What? He's trying to get Abraham to start the fight. And then Gregory jumps in like his little toady and says, what? Are you trying to start a fight, Abraham? Do you quarrel, sir? Are you starting the fight? And Abraham's not going to be roped into this. He's like, quarrel, sir? No, sir. I'm not the one starting the fight. And then Samson says, okay. He wants the fight to happen. So he's like, if you do, sir, I am for you. I serve as good a man as you. So he's saying, if you want to fight, I'm willing. The family I come from is just as good as yours. And Abraham gets in a good line. It's short, but he says, no better. Now that's smart, because what he's saying is, the family you come from is of the same rank. It's not better. Maybe it's worse, but he didn't say it was worse, right? Clever, right? And Samson's like, we can't fight. Well, fine. Well, sir. And then Gregory notices something. Across the stage, some of their family are showing up. And he says, say better. Here comes one of my master's kinsmen. So he's saying, one of the nobles, the people who know how to sword fight, from our family is showing up. You can say that we're better than they are. So Samson's like, oh gosh, now I'm pressured by my friend. Yeah, Abraham, yes, better, sir. And Abraham's like, you lie. Now, once Abraham says he's a liar, it is own. Because you are not allowed to call somebody else a liar. He's challenging his honor. And so Samson's like, draw if you be men. If you're willing to fight, toxic masculinity man, let's do it, right? And then he turns to his friend and he's like, Gregory, remember your good sword fighting move. Gregory, remember thy swashing blow. And they start the fight. Now that's a good place for us to stop. Or it's a good to be continued. Because what happens after that is something that feels very modern and very real. What we have here are cowardly guys who are afraid of looking weak. This happens in our modern world all the time. And because they're afraid of looking weak, they turn to violence. Not because they really want violence against their enemies, because they're afraid of looking weak in front of their friends. But the consequence of their fear in front of their friends is about to go out of control. It starts off as just a fight, and then more and more people get involved, because you know, nothing attracts a crowd like a crowd. You've seen this when there's a fight, right? People show up. Well, then the fight gets bigger, And then Lord Montague and Lord Capulet are like, I can't be seen as not being part of this because their honor feels threatened. And next thing you know, it's a full-on riot. And that's how the play starts. Some guys, out of cowardly fear of looking weak in front of their friends, talking smack, start this whole thing off. This thing that will lead to people dying starts with some punks talking smack. So, that feels believable, right? This would still happen now. This does still happen now. So, if you are interested in seeing what comes next, watch a version of the play. In fact, if you want to see a really cool way of doing it, watch 2 versions of the play and see how different it can be. In the Franco Zeffirelli version, they're going to use swords and knives. In the modern version, remember, Shakespeare was a modern version in his time. In the modern version, they use guns, right? Because those would be the weapons. It's very clever. In Baz Luhrmann's version, on the sides of their guns, the brands are like sword. So they can still talk about, pull out your sword, and they pull out their pistols. But that's the version that is modern, right? Just like Shakespeare's. So check a few different versions out and see how this story works. And then, when you are a sophomore, a junior, a senior, and everybody around you is like, yeah, Romeo and Juliet, we get it, right? We can make references to this story. We all understand it. You will understand it too, because you will have seen it. But in the meantime, make a video of yourself reciting the prologue. Do it your way. Your way could be you read it. That'd be totally fine. I'll post the text to the Google Classroom page. You can find it online. Just type in Romeo and Juliet text in Google. It'll be the very first thing. It's free. The play is, free and available to everyone. But pull up and just make a video of yourself reading the prologue. And it'll be really interesting to compare how different people do it. And nobody is doing it wrong. There is no wrong. You have your own way. And that's one of the things Shakespeare offers you. I'm really excited to see what you do with this. I hope some of you give it a try. Talk to you soon.